Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in the northwestern parts of the Kursk region as well as in the central parts of the Sumy region, expanding the bridgehead across the borderline. The Russians also managed to advance further along the town of Topoli, along the Oskil River line. The Russians have started activity within Sinkivka, south of Kupiansk on the western bank of the Oskil River line. The Russians also managed to advance here near Andreevka, west of Kurokove, and Skutne, northwest of Velikonovasilka. The Ukrainians in turn managed to regain some positions within Konstantinopel, regain positions within Udashne, and advance further and regain some positions within Shevchenko in the southern flank of Pokrovsk. Starting out in the Kursk Sumy region, we see that the Russians made several advances both within the Sumy region and the Kursk region. In the northwestern outskirts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, the Russians managed to gain control over Staraya Soroshina and Nikolaevka here west of Malaya Loknya, aligning the front line along the Malaya Loknya river line here along Malaya Loknya. And the Russians also managed to gain control over several forest lines and fields north of Malaya Loknya, aligning the front line with the town itself. The Russians are here approaching from the northern flank and the western flank of Malaya Loknya, while at the same time, the Russians have also managed to advance further northwards towards Loknya from Lebedivka, where the Russians are here looking to gain control over the entire Loknya and Malaya Loknya river lines here alongside the western bank of Malaya Loknya, before gaining control over the town itself. Gaining control over the remaining three villages of Malaya Loknya, Viktorovka, and Loknya will allow the Russians to have a front line alongside the river line, but also it leaves with no settlements for the Ukrainians all the way to the outskirts of Sucha from the northern direction. So this will align the front line in the northern direction similar to the front line in the southern flank of Sucha within Cherkaskoye Konovelka and Venasivka to the south. This means that the Russians will be able to gain control over a large area here to the north of Sucha and strengthen their positions on the flanks of Sucha from the northern direction. Malaya Loknya itself is the area within this section of the front line, which is the largest town. It is also with the present area in the eastern parts of the town. Therefore, it acts as a well-fortified forward position or outpost for the Ukrainian forces within the northwestern outskirts of the Kursk incursion. This means that it will be difficult for the Russians to gain control of it, but with their attacks on the northern and western flanks, combined with the possibility of a flanking maneuver from the east and from the south, the Russians have the upper hand in this battle and will likely gain control over the towns of Malaya Loknya and Viktorovka soon, especially with the pressure on the supply lines and flanks of Sucha from the southern direction and the increased pressure within the Sumy region, which reduces the Ukrainian ability to properly spread out their forces to defend every part of the section of the front line where the Russians are on the offensive. We see that the Russians have managed to gain control over several positions along the border area between the Russian and Ukrainian border, and to gain control over several forest lines and fields in this area, connecting the front line between Shiravka and Besivka from the Sumy part of the region. So we see that the Russians continue offensive operations both within the Sumy region and the northwestern outskirts and western outskirts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion as they approach the final supply line in and out of the Kursk region for the Ukrainians. According to some reports, the Ukrainians have begun to withdraw from the Kursk region, where they see that there is no benefit in keeping control over it. Especially considering the current US attitude toward Ukraine, it is unlikely that the Ukrainians will get a beneficial peace treaty where the Kursk region will play a significant or important role. Therefore, they are relocating their forces out of the Kursk region, and likely they will redirect it to the Pokrovsk section of the front line, as well as Toretsk and Chasiv Yar here in the southeastern parts of the front line. So we see that the Ukrainians are potentially, if these reports are accurate, withdrawing their forces from the Kursk region, which will indicate that the Russians will likely gain control over the Kursk region within this month or the next one. And with the pressure on the supply lines, it is likely that the Ukrainian Kursk incursion will not last much longer. In the eastern section of the front line along the Oskil River line, the Russians have advanced both northwest of Topoli as they started offensive operations alongside the main road to advance in the direction of Kamyanka from the northern flank, and this is to connect their forces between Kamyanka and Devorishne and Topoli, have a wide front line alongside the Oskil River line and several crossings across to strengthen their forces and presence on the western bank of the Oskil River line for further offensive operations. The Russians have also crossed over from Kurlyakivka into Sinkove, where they have managed to gain a foothold within the western bank of the Oskil River line. There's been no additional advances since they gained control over the bridge area. However, there are reports of Russian presence within Sinkove itself, and based on this, we see that the Russians have sent some reconnaissance groups and some forward soldiers to attempt to establish a bridgehead within the town of Sinkove. If the Russians gain control over Sinkove, it is similar to control over Devorisha. Despite the fact that Sinkove is much smaller, it acts as a main crossing across the Oskil River line, similar to Kupiansk and Devorishne further north. Moving on to the direction of the Pokrovsk section of the front line, here the Ukrainians have managed to regain full control over Udashne, pushing the Russian forces out of the town and out towards the forest lands and fortified positions along the main railway and highway near Kotline. With this, the Russian positions near Kotline are likely going to be falling next if the Ukrainians continue to increase the pressure and the Russians do not regain control over the situation. The Ukrainians also managed to expand their foothold within the town of Shevchenko, which is also a major supply hub and forward position for the Russian forces, protecting the eastern flank of the bridgehead in the direction of Kotline. We see that the Ukrainians are here attacking from 4 separate directions. They're attacking directly towards Kotline from the eastern and northern direction. They're attacking near Udashne to regain control of the town, which they have succeeded in. They're also fighting near Uspenivka towards Novovasilivka, and they're attacking from the eastern direction towards Shevchenko. The objective of the Ukrainians is to gain control and cut off the supply lines between Novovasilivka and Shevchenko, but at the same time they're also attacking the frontline positions to prevent a Russian withdrawal from the frontline positions and also to increase the pressure on the Russian forces in the area. Based on this, we see that the Ukrainians continue their counteroffensive operations here southwest of Pokrovsk, where the objective is to free up the city itself from the heavy Russian pressure. Further south in the direction of Fenderivka, the Russians expanded northwest of the town alongside the forest lines as they look to expand towards the next town of Oleksivka, securing the northern flank before pushing in a western direction to prevent Ukrainian flanking maneuvers to easily cut off the supplies. And this is why it is important to have a wide front line. As we see, the Ukrainians have been launching counterattacks towards Russian positions west of Pokrovsk for the past 2 months almost. And we see that they've managed to regain some positions, but the supply lines are still not cut and are still secure from direct fire. And this is due to the fact that the Russians have had a wide front line, gaining control over several towns, securing the supply lines. In the direction of Konstantinopel, the Ukrainians managed to regain positions here in the western and southern parts of the town, pushing the Russians out to the eastern outskirts. So we see that the Russians managed to gain some positions here in the eastern parts of the town, and the Ukrainians managed to free up the main supply line with their counterattacks. This allowed them to secure the northern parts of the town and to regain positions in the southern parts of it. So with this, we see that the fighting over Konstantinopel is definitely not decided yet, but the Russians increased their pressure from the eastern direction and the Ukrainians increased their pressure from the western direction, where they clash over the town itself. The Russians advance here northeast of Skutne, gaining control over the Mohyali river line towards Dnipro, where the Russians are looking to gain control over the final town here north of Velika Novosilka, in between the Russian positions and the defensive line of the Ukrainians. We see that the Russians are working on a much wider front line than the Ukrainians. However, this allows the Ukrainians to concentrate their forces in one section of the front line, which currently is Pokrovsk, their main focus. And this allows the Ukrainians to gain some advantages that the Russians are unable to due to how far and wide they are spreading out their forces. But the Russians are still numerically superior to the Ukrainians, which indicates that the Russians with a new rotation would likely be able to stabilize that section of the front line. But we'll have to see how the situation develops over the next few days and weeks. If the Ukrainians are able to, despite the numerical inferiority, to gain tactical advantages and operational advantages that allows them to defeat the Russians. Because war is not simply a number game where you have more men, you have more weapons, you simply win. There's also tactics, morale, discipline, overall quality of the forces, quality of the weapons themselves, and much more that determines the outcomes of battles. And even in the final moment where a soldier stands over another, a lower quality, lower disciplined, low morale soldier can still defeat the other soldier simply with luck. A war is never determined until it is over, and that is the general rule, as we've seen in history, where hundreds of soldiers have defeated thousands of soldiers, and that is not an uncommon truth. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.